my comment would be, and it kind of goes back to what several other people have said, I think you would look at it, to me, there is statuary certainly to remember things like the Holocaust. I think in some ways it's the art itself, what it portrays. So for example, a Confederate general on a horse in a powerful position might not be something you ought to be displaying. Maybe it should be some other kind of memorial that says, that this happened and we don't want to repeat it. So that's my comment, is you got to think about the art itself and what does it speak.
Donna, please.
Sorry, I had one other thought, and that is, and maybe it doesn't come to just statues, but for any of us that have gone to Germany and gone through one of the camps, it is just, to me, an emotional experience you don't get any other way to understand what people went through there. So if we want to totally get into remembrance as not doing anything that was hurtful, I mean, do we remove all these camps? And I know that there are some people in Germany who would like them gone. They don't like that they have to remember that all the time. But it becomes a bigger story than just a statue, right? When we talk about remembrance.
Thank you. Meg, I saw you next.
Well, I agree with what all has been said. I think one of the big problems that we are facing today is that people don't know their history anymore. I was a social studies teacher. And when I first started teaching, it was a real pleasure to teach. I mean, I enjoyed it thoroughly, but then gradually things happened, and about all the changes in education and things of that sort. Having to teach the test, and you really couldn't teach the subject, and so forth. But one of the things that I think I've distracted myself and lost my train of thought. But one of the things that that contributed to that was the fact that sports became more important than history. I can remember even when I was still in the convent as a young nun, that when the directive came down that the emphasis in education would be science and math from here on in, and that the other studies would be secondary to that. So that I knew then we were going to have a problem later on, because if you don't teach history, people repeat it. And then the next thing that happened to me is that it came eventually that where most of the people who taught history and things of that sort were the coaches. Now, their way of doing it, and there were exceptions to this, there were certainly some coaches who were good teachers, but they would come in to the class and say, well, I want you to read chapter such and such or page so-and-so and answer these questions. And then the kids would do that, and then they'd just sit around and visit until the class was over. And then another thing that happened was that pressure was put on teachers to always make sure that the stars of the team, basketball or football or whatever, had passing grades. Now, I left 2 schools for that reason. The first one involved 2 boys. We ended up out in the superintendent's mother with parent office and parents and all this other stuff. They were the stars, and they wanted their kids to have passing grades, and the superintendent thought he was going to be able to make me do it. And I held my ground, and one mother didn't say anything, and the other mother, she was all over the place. But anyway, so eventually, I left the school at the end of that because I was anathema as far as the superintendent was concerned. And it also happened at a second school. So But and I'm coming to a conclusion on this. So anyway, but one of the good things, out of bad things, sometimes good things do come. And so one of the good things that came out of that at the first school, years I went back to pick up some papers or something, and I met one of the boys who was an adult and married by this time. And, I was surprised to see them. And anyway, they came over and they were very friendly. And he said to me, I want to thank you for what you did with Mr. Borg and with us. It had made a big difference in my life. I decided to straighten up my life, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, the thing is this, if you don't teach, we haven't been teaching for years now, really teaching it. And, I really think that all of this stuff that is happening today just didn't happen. It's been in the works, been planned for decades. I even back during the Bush administration and the HW and Jimmy Carter, there was talk about this secret society that was really what was in control of the government. But that talk didn't last long. Nobody denied it. It's just they didn't talk about it anymore. So we're in one H of a mess. And some of those, but those are some of the reasons. And so the question is, how can we begin to teach our people the Constitution, the history, things of that sort? How can we inform them? Even as adults, they need to know that. I don't know, but anyway, that didn't solve any problems, but I told you the reason for it.
So if it's okay, I'm going to pick up a couple of threads on this, not because my opinion matters anymore, but the first thing I want to suggest is that remember that remembrance is the opposite of dismembrance. And I think there's something really tough right now when you think about dismembering somebody's humanity. Like, I think one of the worst things we can do is to say that Hitler was not a human being, because it removes him from accountability. And it removes, when somebody has lost a humanity, they're not accountable for what they do anymore. So I think it's really important to remember that all of this could happen again, that it could happen with people who have the best of intentions. Art is a tough thing, right? Because you can't just take away a narrative and expect that it's erased from people's minds. It's even harder, I think, when art has a political message and it's been paid for with public funds. So it seems like one of the things that's important is to have a competing narrative. I don't know what that looks like in statuaries that glorify things that are like racially or sexually unjust, but maybe it looks like art that questions that in direct placement opposed to the other thing. I don't know if that's right or not. I know that part of the thing that we talk about a lot is history, and it occurs to me we're skipping her story. And I think if people knew her story and history, then they would be able to have a little more robust room, right? I mean, you don't learn, even in seminary, you don't learn about dissenting opinions. You learn about history as if there were only one. And this, I do think, is a movement that's happening, is to expand, hey, we've excluded a lot of people in the world with our history because they weren't efficient enough or they didn't blank enough. So there is a movement to make that more robust and integrate that into high schools. And that seems really, really important to me. Because it's Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, that guy was really inspiring unless you were his wife. And that is really important to remember. He was a chronic philanderer, chronic. And there is no reason we should glorify that. And that's not what we glorify. And this, I think, is really important. And I think dismissing the fact that he was a philanderer is hurtful to us. I think over and over again in the Hebrew Bible, the message we get is that God works with imperfect people on purpose, and that you don't have to be perfect to be involved in God's story. And by the way, that doesn't mean the bad things you do are just okay. But I think expanding the narrative becomes really, really important. Otherwise, nobody's good enough. And that's not the message. I mean, here's the really tough thing, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Adolf Hitler was God's gift to the world as a human being. I'm not talking about anything he did. He has to be accountable for what he did because he was God's gift to the world. If that sounds controversial, good. Because that's not just theology, that's art. It's important. I mean, we either buy the gospel that says there's nothing you can do to make God love you more and nothing you can do to make God love you less. We either buy that for everybody or we buy it for nobody. And that's really, really important. Again, that opens the door to accountability. It doesn't take it away. Our Constitution is based on the idea that you deserve a right to a fair trial by your peers. You deserve that, no matter what you've done or having been caught in the act. You get that. That's based on fundamental human dignity. Interesting thing about memorials in Germany, the Germans tried to erase that history themselves. They blew up most of their own concentration camps. And I don't want to like compare art because it's funny. You can go to Dachau, which is one they didn't quite blow up. They got most of it. It's a little chilling. If you go to Auschwitz, it's a different story. Like it's like going from level 1 in hell to level 7 because it didn't get touched. The electrified barbed wire is still there. All the barracks are still there. And the craziest part is on the other side of the fence, you can hear children playing on a public playground in a site that looks exactly like it did when it was killing more than 1 million Jewish men, women, and children. That's a tough story to walk into. To be honest, it was even eerier because I could hear living children playing on the other side of the wall. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. And that's tough business. I think the other last thing is, there's a lot of artistic traditions in the Hebrew Bible that get called idols and they get burned up and they get buried, right? So it's not like the Hebrew people said, hey, these Asherah poles are great ways to preserve our history. They do grind them up, right? And there's all kinds of art. And what's the thing that we often miss is that the temple, when Solomon built it, is full of those forbidden images too. You're not allowed to make an image of anything under heaven and earth. And when you walk into the temple, there's some bronze bulls, which is the symbol for Baal, with a big old basin on its back. And Solomon built that thing and then said it was okay. I mean, this is like an interesting thing to think about. So I don't know. I think all of that really complicates remembrance, right? And remembering is really huge. And dismembering doesn't seem really good. And at the same time, right, what it meant and what it means can be really different things. I don't know that I said anything helpful, sorry. I will say this, if you know anything about Islam, Islam says that the fundamental human problem, the problem is not that we're prideful, it's that we forget. We forget who God is, and we forget who we're supposed to be in relationship to one another. So Islam says, look, there's 5 things you can do that will help you remember. and hear it in this Hebrew way, not like you forget a fact, but that you can reattach yourself to God and one another. And one of those things is to pray 5 times every day. One of those things is to go and walk the story, sort of like going on a pilgrimage. It is the pilgrimage. One of those things is to share your resources with people who don't have any. One of those things is to fast every year, kind of like Lent. It's built in, not so you'll remember a fact you forgot, but that you'll remember that you're not a solo strand in the fabric of humanity. And these are practices. And I think, right, that's the balance between the things like art and statuaries. Do they guide us into the fabric, or do they just pull threads out? And how do you reweave a fabric that's been torn? I think that's the tough work of reconciliation, right? It's easier to start over. It's not better, it's just easier. I just got really preachy and maybe made a lot of bad points. So maybe we should return to the chapter. I don't know the answer. Antha?
So is what you're suggesting that just wholesale tearing down all the statues, it might be the easy way, but is not the most effective way of restoring things, and that it might be better to create more statues and more narratives of the people whose stories aren't currently captured in statuary and honored and respected.
I definitely think that there are very few like easy answers. I think particularly to things like that are iconic and that are like archetypes, to use that Jungian word, right? Like art tends to be, I mean, art is iconic, really. It's like has powers beyond what's right in front of you, you know, that like really get imprinted on the psyche. And so I don't know, you can just scrub the world's collective psyche because you take down a piece of art, you know, like it's there. And I sort of think this is one of the problems we have, like being faithful members of a church, right? Is the narrative is Christians are bigoted, homophobes, and they all are in the Tea Party. And look, I'm not saying you can't be in the Tea Party. I'm just saying that's not the only choice, you know, and unless we offer a competitive narrative, well, then I would tell you the church is completely irrelevant. Based on the way people presume it, I think they're right. I don't think that's true, but that means we have to offer a competing and life-giving narrative. And we don't do it by saying you're wrong. We do it by showing something else. Well, I think. Meg, please.
Well, you know, excuse me. It's so, I know that there are people who do this, but I also know that there are a lot more that don't. You know, and I think it has to do with I think the kind of Christians most of us have been or still are. It is that because we were raised on doctrine and on dogmas and things of that sort. We were taught to love Jesus and that Jesus loved us, and some people took that to heart and really developed a personal relationship with Jesus or with God, whereas others were taught, just as long as I say that I believe in Jesus as my Savior, I'm going to go to heaven. And they can act like they want to. They don't realize that that's not true. So there's been I see a great deal of hypocrisy in churches today. And that's another reason why I think that we are in the trouble that we're in, because God is not first in this country anymore. That we are people who do worship idols of success and so forth. And also, the system has been worked out whereby we have little control over our lives, because most people are either in a car for hours driving to work, then they get to work, and they are not given a just wage, and then they spend hours driving back, and they don't even have time to think. So anyway, I think that is missing, and that people have the opportunity to even really sometimes look for God. And also, the Roman Catholic Church is a disgrace these days, because their priests have backed Trump, and they didn't want to upset their parishioners. They didn't want to cause any conflict and things of that sort. Well, Jesus was no coward. In other words, he even was strong enough that he stood up to the authorities, and he died on the cross for us. So makes me wonder why these priests and bishops even went into the priesthood if they don't have the courage to be what Jesus is calling them to be. and also for Christians. You know, this Christianity is not a religion for cowards. It is a religion for people who have backbone and want to do the right thing. Now, I apologize because I think I got off topic here, and but I think it also is something that fits into the whole fabric of what we're talking about.
Maybe I want to say one last word about remembrance, and then we can go forward or not. Andy Doyle did this at convention last year. He talked about our diocesan history, and I don't know if you realize on the seal of the Episcopal Diocese of Texas is a longhorn, not because of University of Texas, but because when Christ Church Cathedral was being built downtown, a passerby gave as a donation some cattle that helped fund the construction of Christ Church. So look, we're not UT people here. It's the Longhorn, which was a groundbreaking gift in establishing the Episcopal Church in Texas. And the first bishop had means and gave means. He also owned slaves. And Christ Church Cathedral was built in part by slave labor, by slaves who belonged to the first bishop of Texas. And Andy told this story, I think, in a way that talks about this remembrance. It's an iconic building. It's the heart of our diocese, and it was built with slave labor. And that doesn't taint it forever. It's important to remember. And part of what Andy said is a remembrance, right? And if you know anything about the Episcopal Church, you probably know that the Diocese of Texas is the wealthiest diocese in the Episcopal Church because of endowments, some of which were started, what do you know, by slave owners whose money came in part from owning slaves. And that money has allowed us to do a lot of wonderful things in mission. It has. And because of the other part, right, the Diocese of Texas, the Diocesan Corporation has opened up endowments towards racial justice and racial reconciliation as a way of remembering. I want you to hear that, remembering. It's not about reparations, because that's a different concept. It is about remembering the people who are all too easily swept under historical narratives. And one of the things, because we're talking about statuaries, is that $13 million is coming out of these diocesan foundations, like today, like right now. And parishes can apply for grants to access these funds for a couple of major ways. One is to help tell the story of racial history in their area, research, right, and tell the story that all too easily gets swept under the rug. Another thing that they have in mind is to put historical landmarks, whether those are lynchings or baptisms of people who were brought over, who helped start churches. And, you know, look, it's interesting to think, right, like what a Hidden Figures monument would mean in this community. And maybe it wouldn't mean something to people, and it's part of our history. Well, it's part of her story. This is an interesting thing to think about, right? Because many people have seen that film, right? Many people have seen the film, but there's not a marker for that. And we are, you know, sacramental physical people, and markers matter. And markers are important, not just like virtual entertainment, but ways of helping us to reconnect people who otherwise just fall out of view and fall out of focus and fall out of the body. Antha.
Do we know if the cathedral is considering putting up some kind of piece of art to remember and honor the labor of those slaves that worked on the building? Because I think that would be, you know, a wonderful thing for them to do.
I don't know the answer to that. My suspicion is probably, and you know, when you think about memorials like that, they really are kind of hard to come by. But you have the diocese willing to help fund those things is really interesting. I mean, it's a pretty easy memorial to make, right? Is to have a statue of somebody putting one of the one of the bricks in place. You know, I mean, that's not a tough thing to even imagine.
Yeah, it'd be nice if it were paired with history, which it sounds like,
Of course.
you know, that the diocese is working on. So glad they're doing that.
Yeah, and look, in our case, right, like Hidden Figures, those women, weren't members of St. Thomas. They weren't. The members of St. Thomas were the people who benefited from their labor, like Jim Lovell. I mean, I'd tell you, Charlie Bolden's an interesting guy, right? I mean, he's the first Black director of NASA as a Black man, was a member of the parish here, sang, led the fall festival. I mean, that's the thing to celebrate, right? I mean, he was, if I'm right, I think he was also the first, or was he the first or second Black astronaut, period. And then those ladies, right, who worked across the street and couldn't use the restroom in the building they worked in, they didn't come here, but that's in our community, right? And you can't build a memorial like that on government grounds unless you're the government. I don't know. Anyway, these are interesting things to think about, because like the stories out in entertainment and what we need, right, educationally, are ways to spiral so that the story comes deeper and the remembrance becomes greater. I'm not saying we should build a Hidden Figures memorial, although maybe it wouldn't be bad. We probably talked this to death. I apologize, but I'm grateful that we did. And look, at the end of the day, I don't think we have a vote, because I hope what's important is, A, that's not our prerogative. We don't have the power to do it. And B, like, it's just really complicated. You know, I think anybody who tries to flatten an issue and say like there's a silver bullet answer, I don't think there is. And what do you do with things that are idolatrous? And I'm going to tell you, you know, my mom grew up in Kentucky, which was on the northern side. It was a Union side. And she was taught that the Civil War was the war of northern aggression. She learned that in high school. And I happen to think quite a bit of my mom. And you go to Austin, Texas, you go to the Capitol, there's a monument towards the war of northern aggression, and it reads just like that. And that's interesting, right? Because that was built with public funds, and it's still there. And when I see it, I kind of, well, it's like laughable, but it's not funny. I mean, this is really tough stuff, really tough. Yeah. Okay, maybe we should talk about Shalom instead. I don't know. I don't want to force this. Maybe I should just give a minute and see if we want to talk about remembrance anymore, because I do think it's really, really important. I don't know if you realize this. In Germany, if you call somebody a Nazi, it's a hate crime. You're not allowed to call somebody a Nazi. Like, you will be arrested for that. It constitutes fighting words in US law. I mean, we have free speech, but you can't use fighting words without repercussions. I don't know if you know this. You have free speech, but if you go up to Samuel and you call him a string of epithets, like, that's not constitutionally protected.
Well, we see today the effect of bad words, of cruel words. I mean, we're no stranger to it.
I know we're not just talking about, Darlene, please.
This connects for me on a psychological level, and I had planned to talk with you about this some on Wednesday when we talk about laying down burdens. One of the things I work with people on is not when we want to lay down part of ourselves that we consider sins or burdens or residue, trying to get rid of those things. Those things played a big part in our history, our personal history. They served a purpose for us in that history. Sometimes they started out as good things, kind of, but they morphed into things that were destructive for us. And when we try to let go of those things, to deny them, totally deny them, there's some resistance to that. But if we can honor those things, that they served us at that time, but we choose to let go of them now. They had a purpose in our history, not only our national history, but our personal history. And if we acknowledge them and at the same time decide to let them go, there are ways that we can put them aside, rituals that we can go through to put them aside and say, I choose to do something different, or I choose to think differently, I choose to live differently. To me, there's a personal as well as a societal connection to that thinking of putting aside monuments. How are we going to do that? Are we going to, we can't tear them down. We would like to maybe, but putting them aside, like somebody said, in a museum, or erecting new monuments, developing new behaviors that we've decided that are going to replace those old destructive behaviors.
I know we're talking about statues, and I can't resist saying one other thing, right? Which is that part of the core issue for me with remembrance goes to language itself, right? I mean, I think probably everybody on the screen is, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm hoping we've sort of figured out that white folks using the N-word is not really a great practice. In fact, that's just something categorically one ought not do. And so, you know, again, like laying that aside and recognizing, right, that leads to, and no matter what you think it means, it belongs to a tradition greater than yourself, and it represents something greater than you individually represent, becomes really important. And I don't know if you saw this, if you're aware, and I don't want to be super political, but I have to tell you that when AOC gave this speech last spring about the exchange she had with a fellow congressperson, I realized for the first time, I think in my life, that it's a similar thing for a male person using the B word. It's just, it's a word that cannot really be used against it without drawing up, frankly, gender inequality. These are the kinds of things that I think start to matter, is identifying things that are so deeply toxic that, again, it doesn't matter what your intention is, it comes out of a tradition that is so exclusionary and exclusive that it's incumbent upon us to do something different. There's a host of words like that. And, you know, I do think, like, for me, you're going to hear me do this a lot. Like, I don't change the liturgy in the bulletin, but I don't read it either, because there's words I just can't say authentically. Now that you may not share that with me, which is why I don't change the liturgy. That's there. But for me, it's important to say daughters and sons instead of sons and daughters. It's important. It's important for me to say kingdom instead of kingdom. I mean, then it's silly, and it isn't. It means a great deal to me. So it's not my job to change the liturgy, but it is my job to curate art. Okay, maybe we should talk about Shalom now. This is chapter 8. And I really want to start with that one up front, because in some ways it is like one of those words that, like, churchy people know and we like to use. And a lot of people didn't realize that the cognate in Arabic is the word salam. And the greeting, of course, in Arabic that you say whether you're in Saudi Arabia or Iran or Africa or parts of India, you say, As-salam alaikum. God's peace be with you. And that's what they're saying. As-salam alaikum. And the reply is, Lekam as-salam. And also with you. And also with you, shalom. Right? And sometimes I think we treat it as, hey, we translate it as peace, or it's a way of saying hello. And I think the author does a good start to dialing down that it's like a much deeper, broader concept than it is a cognate.
I was surprised by this chapter. I thought love would be the really big word for me in here, because I think that's super important. But actually, the let me find it. The shalom, the part that says you're wishing the well-being of all around you, and that's like a practice that you do all the time. It's like tells me how to live. I mean, love is behind it, but that's a really good action word.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. And I don't know if you all realize this, but the book of James barely made it into the New Testament. I mean, really, it was on the razor's edge. The Council of Constantinople in 381 almost cut it. And Martin Luther actually put it in the back of the Bible because he hated it. But the book of James sort of says, if you wish somebody shalom and you don't do anything to affect that, it's like worse than not saying anything at all. I mean, it's sort of an interesting concept, right? Is that the goal is not that you say, I wish you have peace, but that you become instrumental in bringing it. John, your hand was up.
Rhonda, I think that the quote in this book that I really like about shalom is that it refers to peace of body, mind, spirit, and relationship. I mean, it encompasses a lot. And my thought as I was reading this section was, why don't we use this more often in our church?
Yeah, probably because it would sound really weird. I mean, I think the way we would do it, right, is if we could actually sort of buy into it as a group, and then take it with us. And you have to spend time on a word for it to have any traction. I mean, you realize when we say the peace of the Lord be always with you, that's really what we're saying. It's supposed to be this context and concept of shalom. And we only say that peace after we do the confession and the absolution. And the origin of that practice is that people were actually supposed to go to each other and make amends in the service. It's hard to do virtually. But the idea was you went to church and you got reconciled. And the peace might have taken a long time instead of 30 seconds, How we practice that's really tough. Somebody was just telling me they listened to a podcast this week about how, people, if they really want pastoral care, they don't go to churches, they go to bars. Or they go to, because the bartender is supposed to be compassionate and listen. And if you go to a church, people might say yeah, you're a dirtbag. It was a really interesting takeaway, that we have this expectation that people are going to be really judgy in church and really open in bars. And that's kind of sad. More than kind of sad. Donna, sorry.
One of the things that I had highlighted was God's vision of shalom entails riches beyond comprehension, peace from foreign and inner demons. And I think for me, the difference in the word peace, because I think we can all make peace with things, with things that we may not be too excited about, but we can make peace with them. But I think the difference in shalom is that it entails riches beyond comprehension. So it's not just making it okay, it's making it like grand. So I thought that was pretty, I thought this was an interesting one.
And maybe that's an argument in favor of using the word shalom instead of peace, because I just think we use peace as like, hey, you're not fighting. You know, and like my mom wanted there to be peace in the house, which meant my brother and I weren't actively fighting. But it didn't mean we constructed a meaningful, deep relationship, you know. I mean, I think we like relegate peace to just quiet instead of like, frankly, something that can be exhausting. You know, I mean, real peace can be really tiring. It just happens to also like increase the joy quotient, you know, like it doesn't mean it's effortless or laborious. I mean, because it's King Weekend, right? I mean, King said that peace isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. And I just think we culturally don't use the word peace at that deeper level. And that seems really, really important. You know, and like one of the things that's important, I think, going back to the art tradition and like people's humanity, is this sort of Buddhist mindfulness practice where like there's somebody who is causing you not to have peace, and you're able to meditate and just say like, hey, may you be free from pain. You know, like that'd be a good start. The people that drive us crazy, not like leave me alone, but like I just hope you're free from pain. There's another really neat tradition, and those of you who went to Jordan, you didn't get to hear it, unfortunately, because our guide was like an Orthodox Christian, not a Muslim. But the first time I went, I had a guide who was a regular guide. You know, he was just a regular guy, and he would tell us what we were doing the next day. Like tomorrow, we're going to go to Petra, and he would always end the sentence with inshallah. I don't know if you know this word, inshallah. It's the Arabic word that means like God willing. And it was really, he wasn't pompous with it at all, like people were when I went to church here, when people would say, well, God willing, we'll do this. It came across as really pompous when I was a kid. But when this guy said it, it was really like, look, you know, we've got these plans and we hope that they happen, but we sort of know it's all not up to us. I mean, I actually thought it was like this really great practice. And he said it all the time. All the time he would say inshallah as our tour guide. You know, it was really a lovely way of talking. Yeah, and again, think about what difference it would make if you're walking in the morning and you see somebody. I mean, they would think you're crazy, you know. They're like, "Hey," and you're like, "Shalom." It's something that it takes a lot of investment to like create a word that's meaningful, right? And thinking through that at a local level, you know, it's probably worth the investment. Antha?
I think that would be great. I was thinking about how we could bring this word in all its fullness back, because it is such a wonderful concept and such a great thing to wish for other people and yourself.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, like at the point in where we do the peace too, I don't know if you realize this, we say the peace of the Lord be always with you, right? Which is a really like kind of passive-y thing. And really that word be comes from that Hebrew word, which is like existence in all of its modalities. Like the peace of the Lord was always with you, will be, shall be, could be, like all of that sort of wrapped up. I mean, honestly, like maybe it would be better liturgy to say like the peace of the Lord is always with you. Because that would create a little bit of cognitive dissonance. Wow, I don't feel like I'm experiencing that right now. I mean, that's an interesting claim. And then if you don't have to double down on it, right, you could say the shalom of the Lord be always with you. I think as long as it didn't sound, it's just a hard thing. Like when we use these foreign words, sometimes it gets really like, sometimes they just get so cutesy. I mean, I grew up in churches that did this. Like we did the word study on agape love and phileo love and eros love. And we ranked them, which by the way, there's no rank. There are different ways of expressing of expressing like qualities of love. And we always learned like erotic love was inferior to agape love, and it is not. And the Bible never does it that way. It's just qualities of love. And like, again, like how you do it at enough level where it has traction instead of being like, oh, that's like weird church speak. You know, think through, our vestry's talked a lot about evangelism, right? And it's a word that's sort of like, you use the E word, you know, because it's been co-opted to mean like one thing. And to push back against it is really hard. And it just means good news, right? It means good news. And, but it means it in this particular way, right? And so like, it's one of those interesting things, like, are we like bringing good news to people or not? I mean, I kind of think giving people food if they don't have any is like good news. So like a mobile food distribution is like the best kind of evangelism. And maybe it's nice to call it that. Instead of service at St. Thomas, we say evangelism at St. Thomas. Instead of outreach, we call it evangelism. You would say, oh no, evangelism is like when you try to convert people. No, it isn't. Not in the Bible. Evangelism is when you give somebody some good news. Good news. You are worth having the supplies you need for school, whether you can afford them or not. I think that's pretty good news. Just saying. Kathy, you were gonna say something.
Yes, but I think the word carries so much baggage today that I really would push back against using that. We're feeding the hungry. That's how I think about it. Nothing's attached to it. When you think of evangelism, you think something's attached.
And this, I think, is the hard thing going back to art and memorials, right? The Red Cross feeds hungry people. And we're not the Red Cross because we do it, I think, from a different place spiritually. Frankly, we do it from an overt spiritual recognition.
But we do it from our parking lot. We're not doing it from the parking lot at the strip mall that's gone now, but anyway.
Yeah, but if we did, it seemed like it'd be really important to say, hey, this is our evangelism, have some food. Nice to see you.
Well, then maybe we should put a little something in the bag of food.
I'm not trying to be catty with this, but you know there's words out there that have been so co-opted, like sin and redemption and absolution. It's like the option is like we have to either invent a whole bunch of new words or we have to say like we resist that word being co-opted because it's come to mean something it didn't mean, and we're going to go back to what it used to mean. Like you can't have our language. You cannot take it away from us. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's silly.
Maybe you could just put good news in parentheses, evangelism.
By the way, I'm not talking about making any signs, you know, but I am talking about concepts. And to be honest, like what we do with the talk, I don't know the answer.
Well, I like that, Rhonda, you're thinking.
I don't know if you know this. When I got here 6 years ago, there was a lot of language about, well, there's outreach and there's in-reach. There is no such thing. There is us practicing the gospel or not. Having facilities that don't leak, that serve the community, that's the gospel. That's good news. I'm sorry, that's good news. If they don't leak and we don't share them, that is not good news. But we do. Making the building attractive so that we can serve people, that's part of our mission. Making the building attractive for an exclusive group of people is not part of our mission.
Yeah, but who decides what's attractive?
Who decides? The aesthetics committee. And I see one of them on the screen right now, two of them. Yep. You don't have to identify yourselves. Yeah, we do our best, but you know, again, we live into this bifurcated reality that's artificial, right? The question is what we're doing upholding God's message for the world? Is it practicing love? Is it practicing peace? Making. I don't know if you know this, but the word Hesed, that word for unconditional love that the chapter brings out, it's spelled with an H, but it's a CH sound. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the word Hanukkah. It should be pronounced Chanukah. It's a guttural, it's like a CH in English. This word Hesed is the most recurring word in the Psalms outside of the definite or indefinite article. So this is like the equivalent to agape, like steadfast love, unconditional love. That's the most recurring word in the Psalms. Do we want to, maybe we should pause here. Maybe next week we should come back to talk about holiness and glory, which I think are some really great things. And if we have some other thoughts on remembrance, great too. Maybe any last comments or last thoughts? Kathy, go for it.
Inshallah. I love that.
Inshallah, we will do this next week. Yes, inshallah.
Inshallah is a great word. And once you use it, because Lauren came back from Saudi and learned that word, I just find it useful. God willing, God willing, God willing.
You know, what's really beautiful about it too is that it calls God Allah. I mean, it's just really this common humanity that offers to build a bridge across a religious breach by us using on purpose. I mean, it's really nice. Again, think a bit how in Arabic you don't say hello, you say God's peace be upon you. I mean, that's just so lovely, isn't it?
It is.
Well, inshallah, we will gather next week and sort of wrap up chapter 8 and see, you know, chapter 9 short. So I might encourage you to read that as well. And then we'll talk about where we want to go after that. In 2 weeks, it's the annual meeting, so we won't have a study. We'll have the annual meeting. But I would invite you, if you find some free time, to think about this concept of remembrance, not just with art, but with words, and what difference that can make in our practice of Shalom and Hesed. And so, so peace be with you, and I'll see you next week, inshallah.
Bye.